Good morning. My name is John, and on behalf of City Legal, it's my pleasure to extend to you a very warm welcome to you this morning, wherever you're joining us from. We've got people coming from right across Australia, so welcome. By way of background, I've been working with Peter Wrench and the rest of the City Legal team this year as part of my 2-year apprenticeship program with City Bible Forum and my local church at St. Matthias in Paddington. But don't be alarmed. I am a qualified lawyer. I've practiced corporate advisory law with a firm in Sydney CBD. So I have some experience despite my youthful appearance this morning. Well, this morning we're finishing the term at City Legal by listening to and participating in what has been described as one of the most important interviews of the year between David Robertson and Greg Sheridan. Earlier in the term, we heard from David, our local Scottish import, as he walked us through his experience with a famous phrase from one of the songs in the Bible, the phrase, "He brought me out into a spacious place." And he provided some reflections on freedom and what it looks like. It was raw and incredibly thought-provoking. Well, Greg Sheridan is the Foreign Affairs editor for The Australian and one of Australia's most influential national security commentators. He's an author of 8 books, including his best-selling book, God is Good for You. And Greg has just released his new book titled Christians, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. It has been described by ABC broadcaster Richard Glover as vividly written, compellingly argued, and captivating for believers and non-believers alike. Jesus jumps from the pages of the book. And this would be just the starting point of David's interview with Greg this morning. But we're not just listening. At home, we can participate too in the discussion. And if you'd like to ask a question to be answered, please head to the link to ask questions through Slido. That link will be posted constantly through the chat function of your Zoom call during the interview. And through Slido, you can ask your question and also upvote other questions that have been asked by others to make sure the questions you want answered get asked. So please keep an eye out for that link in the chat function this morning. Now, before David and Greg take it away, Jai is going to read a quick excerpt from Luke's biography of the life and ministry of Jesus. So I'm going to invite Jai to read that for us from Luke 1:1-4. And then it's over to Greg and David. Thanks, Jai.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Jai, and I have the privilege of reading the Bible for us this morning. The passage is the book of Luke, chapter 1, verses 1-4. Verse 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
Okay, folks, we're here. I hope that Greg is unmuted. I can see that he's here. Greg, are you unmuted yet?
Yes, David, although I tell you what, a lot of people pay good money to make me be muted, but it's great to be with you.
Great to be with you. And now I understand you're not an early morning person, so this is really appreciated.
Yes, that's I have to confess that's true. So if I babble more incoherently than usual, you just have to forgive that.
Whereas my background was I used to get up for the 5 o'clock milking, so I'm halfway through my day. So listen, let me just say to the folks who are watching, my name's David Robertson, by the way. Those of you who are watching this, you can put in your question in the Slido or on the chat, preferably on the Slido. In fact, and we're not going to have a specific question time at the end. It's just as we go on, I'll look at your questions. I'm identifying as a female here because I can multitask. I can talk to Greg and watch the Slido. Greg, look, this book, it really surprised me. Okay, I mean, I read God is Good. I read your articles. I appreciate very much your insights, particularly into China and foreign policy, and love your style of writing. But what shocked me about this book, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, when I'd seen extracts from it in the Australian or mentioned elsewhere, they tend to be the bits towards the end about the faith of Australian politicians, and, Scott Morrison and Bob Hawke and others and so on. But you begin this book, you begin it with the cross. Why?
Well, David, again, it's really kind of you to invite me to be with you this morning. It's a great privilege. So, David, I've been a lifelong Christian, and rising from the last book, a few people said to me that that's all very well, Greg, but where is the living Jesus in this book? So I really spent a couple of years much more intensely in the New Testament than I normally do, and the personality of Jesus is absolutely compelling. But I did come to the view, it's not very original really, that really the cross, the death and suffering of Jesus are actually the most radical claim of Christianity, even more so than the Easter rising. And because nowhere in human sensibility that I'm aware of, or in any religious tradition, is the idea that the all-powerful, everlasting, immortal, eternal, omniscient God should be humiliated, defeated, suffer physical death, die at the hands of his enemies. And when I read the account of the crucifixion in the Gospels, it was just so immediate and so raw and so gripping, and such a stark account. I thought this is the essence of Jesus' humanity, that he's willing to be with us and to suffer with us and to share in our experience of suffering. So I found, reading the New Testament book by book from start to finish, as it were, which I'm ashamed to say I hadn't really done before. I just found the human immediacy of the crucifixion extraordinary, and at times overwhelming in its effect. The moment Jesus is born, all this suffering with such dignity, but the moment where he calls out, "I thirst," is almost an unbearable moment to read, really. So I was just struck by the immediacy of this experience.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Gospels, they're not, Western people tend to read them like Western biographies, and they're not, for lots of reasons. First of all, in terms of how they do time, it's very different from what we would do. But you don't have biographies that focus 50% on the death of the person, and that's what the Gospels do. So it is quite extraordinary. I mean, I was actually deeply moved by your first chapter. Paul talks about preaching Christ crucified, which is as being at the very heart of the gospel. And he talks about how to many people that's offensive. People are looking for a sign, or they're looking for wisdom, and it seems to them both foolishness and a pretty stupid sign. But it is, you're right, it's the very heart and essence. Speaking of Paul, I was intrigued with the title that you described him as Christ's Lenin. Can you explain that, please? Well,
David, I tried to read the Gospels and then the letters in the New Testament as a journalist, to read them like I would read any other document. And of course, I believe they're true. I started reading them with the belief that they're true, but nonetheless, to look for narrative, incident, character. And what a great character Paul is. I loved all his irascible, raw, magnificent, contradictory humanity. He's such a heroic and magnificent figure, but he can be so bad-tempered, and he's very blunt in his speech, and he's confronting at times, and difficult for the other apostles and other disciples. Lovely passage in Peter, which says, "Yeah, I know Paul can be a bit difficult, but you just got to put up with him." But Paul, of course, is nothing like Lenin in moral terms. I mean, Lenin was a murderous communist tyrant. He wouldn't even listen to Beethoven because it made him feel nice about human beings, and he didn't want to feel nice about human beings, whereas Paul was an apostle of love. But they were alike in this very specific way. The genius of Lenin was that he was a profound theoretician of communism, but also a brilliant organizer, and he brought it to state power. So he combined this sort of theory and practice very powerfully. Paul, of course, was a great theoretician of the early Jesus movement. Theoretician is a wrong word, but it's a sort of a political journalist word. So he understood the theology of Christ at a very profound level, but he was also a magnificent organizational genius. So I think Paul is one of the most important figures in human history, and he combined this deep theoretical understanding with this deep practical way of taking power. He was the first city intellectual in the Christian movement. He mastered the Jewish world, the Greek world, and the Roman world. He fused them all together. He fused them with Christianity. And he tore out the mind of the ancient world. You know, the ancient world was based on hierarchy and inequality, masters better than slaves, men better than women, and so on. And Paul preached this radical universalism of Christ. There is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. And he really ripped out the mind of the ancient world. And so, I mean, some of my Christian friends were pretty unhappy with that title, and I had to reassure them that I wasn't saying that Paul bore any moral resemblance to Lenin. But I do want secular readers too to just get a sense of what a big figure in history Paul was.
Oh, you know, I love the title, but you know, I used to have a Leninist cap, you know. I love the title for lots.
A bit of a Lenin beard there, really, too, you know.
Yeah. No, that's our mutual friend Steve McAlpine. No. The thing that intrigues me about that is Paul. I think Paul took Greek civilization, Greek language, Plato's concepts and other things, which in common grace came very close. You know, they were mixed in with Plato in particular. He had an awareness of Moses and, you know, the Hebrew understanding. I think he basically baptized it. And I think he turned the world upside down by just, I mean, he's a brilliant writer as well, which I'm sure you appreciate. You know, I'm reading through Romans at the moment and Romans 8, and you're thinking, how did he manage to condense so much into so little space, where every phrase is pregnant with meaning, and deliberately so? You know, it's quite remarkable. You know, I laugh at my atheist friends who say, well, how can you believe a book that is written by illiterate desert shepherds? To which my point is always, first of all, if they're illiterate, how could they write? And have you read John chapter 1? And have you read Romans 8? Have you read Romans? Because that is not the product of an illiterate mind or someone who doesn't think. It's brilliant. Listen, I've got a question for you. And I say to people again, if you want to ask questions, go onto the Slido, just click on the link on the chat and you can ask a question. This is from Kenneth. Cultural wars are presently against Christians. People say cultural Christianity is dead and all that's left is being a faithful remnant that is uncompromising and seeks for presence. Is that too defeatist or negative, or is there a way through that? It's quite a complex question, but.
Yes, so David, I think that is too defeatist. And I'll sort of begin by referring back to Paul. So what you were just saying about Paul being a great writer is true. And Paul operated in a much more hostile environment than we're operating in, a much more hostile environment. The great Leszek Kolakowski, the Polish philosopher, wrote a book called Religion. And he said the thing about Paul was he simply refused to negotiate with the pagan world. And Paul didn't offer a civic disobedience. He certainly didn't offer a military threat to the pagan world or anything. But he offered a radical message of Jesus. And I think Paul stands in, the reason I'm using Paul in my crabwise way to get to this question is that Paul stands in place of us modern believers, because unlike the other apostles, Paul was not there at the time of Jesus' ministry on earth. So Paul is an example of how close a relationship a Christian can have with Jesus, even though he didn't meet him. There's a passage in Paul where he says, you know, Christ poured himself out for me and gave his life for me. And Paul feels that very personally. Now, what Paul did, he was starting from a much more marginalized place than we are. But the first thing he did was to build up Christian communities. And he was absolutely tireless in this. He didn't see himself as a faithful remnant. He took to heart the command to go and convert the nation, spread the good news to people all over the world. In our present circumstance, I do think that culture has become hostile to Christianity, but still maybe half of Australia is Christian, or is at least nominally Christian. And we are not persecuted in the way that Christians are in many parts of the world, in China, in Pakistan, in Africa. And I think we just need to, so the first thing, one reason I wrote this book was to encourage people to own their Christianity. So I felt that I've been a journalist for 42 years. The culture had gone from being only nominally, but at least nominally pro-Christian, through to being neutral, through to being anti-Christian. And I thought, well, if circumstance and history accidentally give you a public microphone, if you don't use it, that's a bit cowardly. And then, of course, also Christianity is such a great story. There's a huge reservoir of people who have a smattering of Christianity and want to be brought back, who just need a bit of encouragement and a bit of reminding. And then there's a generation which is so post-Christian that it's effectively pre-Christian. It's never heard of really of Christianity. And so you go to them and the message is completely fresh and astonishing. So, I mean, you can say that the culture is hostile, and none of us, including me, has the power to change the culture altogether by ourselves. But conversion has always been a person-by-person experience. I think we need to build our own communities, build our own faith, and speak boldly to the culture, always in a good spirit, in a good heart. We need to be as clever as our enemies, but much more kind, much more kindly, and much more good-humoured, and where possible, even with a bit of humour. But I think it's not the faithful remnant, where we have a lot of institutions, a lot of people, a lot of followers, a lot of capacity to speak out. It's really just a question, are we going to bear witness publicly as well as in our private families?
Yeah, and I think there's a sense in which we need to always see the bigger picture. If you look at it purely from, let's say, demographic trends within a particular context at a particular time, you might look and say, oh, things aren't so good. But if you look at it in the context of, if the gospel is true, then, you know, you look at the early disciples, pre-Paul and after Paul, there's a handful of them, and they took on the Roman Empire, and they defeated the Roman Empire, not through politics, but, as you say, by the radicalness of this message. And I'm reminded of a time I was asked to appear on a television show, and basically it was, believe it or not, to do with alcohol. And I was all signed up. And then the producer said to me, by the way, what are your views on alcohol? And I said, well, if it's not malt, it's blasphemous. And she went, oh, what? You drink? I said, yeah, of course, don't get drunk. And then she actually said to me, David, that's too reasonable. We're looking for I said, basically, you're looking for a guy in a dog collar who's going to yell, you're going to hell for drinking a glass of wine. She said, yes. I said, well, no. She said, well, we can't have you on because you're too reasonable. And I said to her, is that more threatening? And she said, yes, absolutely. It's much more threatening. And I feel that is, when I read your book, there's a great reasonableness in it. And, you know, let me ask a question about China, because somebody else is asking one. But I'll preface it by saying that I think Xi Jinping is right to regard Christianity as the biggest threat to the Chinese Communist Party, because it requires a loyalty that's not political and that the state cannot dictate. And by not being political, it's a much bigger threat to him. And, you know, anyway, here is this question on China's on everyone's lips at the moment. Can you combine your great knowledge of Asian geopolitics with your interest in Christianity to comment on how the rise of Christianity may positively ultimately influence China away from its current belligerent stance?
Sure, David, I'll get right into that, but I'll just offer a further counterpoint on our last topic as well. I interviewed the great Nicky Gumbel, you know, the progenitor of the Alpha course at Holy Trinity Brompton, and he referred me to a time, 1750, when there were 16 people who attended Easter services at St. Paul's Cathedral, and there were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets of London. And you would have said Christianity in Britain is just about finished. And then along came the Wesleys, the Methodist revival, Wilberforce, and all over Britain, there was this fabulous rebirth of Christianity. And historically, we don't want to be complacent about this, but we certainly can take some encouragement. Historically, it's been at moments like this that the church, broadly considered, has rebounded. And then also in the book, I interview an American Pentecostal evangelical pastor, Sammy Rodriguez. He makes Hollywood movies because Hollywood is so hostile. He goes out, raises the funds, makes movies. They're big success in box office. They haven't done that well in Australia. And then the final example I'd offer is that series, The Chosen. You know, they couldn't get it financed, so they crowdfunded it. Now it's been watched by millions of people. But I'm sorry, get on to China. I have 2 chapters on China in the book. I was a China correspondent in 1985. I was the first Beijing correspondent for the paper, and China has been a very big part of my life. Christianity in China is one of the most incredible success stories of Christianity in the last 100 years. When the communists came to power in 1949, there were 3 or 4 million Christians. Now in China, there is somewhere between 60 million and 120 million. For reasons I outline in the book, it's a bit hard to get a precise number of Christians. About 10 million Catholics, about the rest would be the church movement, a sort of evangelical Protestant church, house church movement. Now, they have at times suffered astounding persecution. It began badly in the 1950s. In the Cultural Revolution, priests and nuns were put in cages, put in cathedrals for public mockery. Since Xi Jinping came to power, there's been a great tightening of suppression of Chinese Christianity. To be fair, there's also been suppression of all other religious groups in China, not only the Muslims in Xinjiang, but even Buddhists. Buddhists are being required to put pictures of Xi Jinping in their temples and so on. But I argue a slightly radical case in the book, which is that the Communist Party of China itself is a religious organization. And communism in the 20th century was, in a sense, a religious movement. So the Communist Party of China hates Christianity, partly because it offers an alternative explanation of the human condition. And it appeals certainly to marginal people, but it appeals also to well-educated, clever, successful people in Chinese cities. And the Communist Party really finds this very threatening and distressing. Now, just very briefly, what do I mean when I say the Chinese Communist Party is essentially a religious organization? The CCP tries to offer a complete explanation of human life. It's not a political organization in the normal sense of politics. It also has its own dusty metaphysics, and it has what it regards as an eternal doctrine and then a specific Chinese application. So its official ideology is Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And Marxism, Leninism, if you like, is the eternal teaching, which is only very slightly about economics. It's mainly about state power and the Communist Party being the engine of history. And the specific application is Mao Zedong thought. That's the way you apply these eternal doctrines to China. It's very scriptural. It has its own sacred scriptures, and it has a very scriptural approach to those. It also sees as one of its central purposes giving existential meaning and purpose to the life of Chinese citizens. So the purpose under the CCP is that you further the party, you further the nation, and you complete the proletarian revolution. And then along comes this Christianity, and again, its universalism is very disturbing. It's not nationalistic. It doesn't fit into any political category. It's not representing the landlord class or the proletarian class. It's not geographically specific. And it challenges the dusty metaphysics and metaphysical aridity of the Chinese Communist Party, and the Communist Party can't control it. There are some wonderful historical echoes. I recall some dialogues between the emperor in the 1750s and the Jesuit missionaries who were there. And of course, it also recalls St. Paul's experience in the Acts of the Apostles, where at one point in Greece, he's accused of preaching foreign gods. And this, in a sense, is what Xi Jinping is trying to label Christianity as a foreign religion, whereas, of course, it's a universal religion. So I think Chinese Christians, so I interview a couple of Chinese Christians clandestinely through secure phone lines, and I interview a former Singapore minister who is culturally and ethnically Chinese. And I think Chinese Christians are incredibly inspiring. We should sort of celebrate their story and offer them whatever meagre assistance we can. You know, I had a great friend, an English academic, Audrey Donathorne, who used to smuggle Bibles into China at a time when Bibles were suppressed. And she'd go into China, and she's a wonderful Margaret Rutherford-style woman, and she'd have Bibles in Chinese secreted about her person, and the border guards didn't know what to do with her. And she made her whole life really helping the church in China. And this is a wonderful story. If we feel a bit discouraged in our society, we should look at Chinese Christians and look to their example.
Absolutely. I mean, the two chapters in the book on that are absolutely fascinating. I mean, to back up what you're saying, now we're moving, I think we're almost moving away from Mao Zedong thought to Xi Jinping thought being
Yes.
taught in schools. Some of the churches are being asked to have thoughts of Xi Jinping, placed up on the walls instead of the 10 Commandments, all that kind of stuff. So there's a very strong religious component. Now, in terms of the Chinese as well, I would say this, that I'm not so au fait as you are with the Chinese Catholic Church, but I know amongst Protestant leaders, and they wouldn't call themselves Protestant, they'd be independent, but I'm aware of and have had contact with, I would say, that young Chinese leaders just now, first of all, they are young. Well, to me, they're young. They're in their 40s. They're remarkably intelligent and remarkably, I actually think they're going to provide leadership for the church in the whole world in the future. I do think the 21st century, church-wise, will be either the African or the Chinese century as opposed to European. But look, we've got questions and they're on Slido. And I'm saying to folks, if you put your questions on chat, put them onto Slido and you can vote questions up. So what I'm going to do in the remaining time we've got is just, if we can go through as many of these questions as possible, and I'll start with the most popular, because what happens is people vote for them. Having read the Gospels and the letters, what would you say to those who say that it was Paul who invented Christianity?
So I write about this in the book, and I strongly disagree with that. And Paul himself would strongly disagree with that. I don't want to be theologically heterodox here, but to read the Gospels and the letters as a journalist reads them, like source documents, one of the things about them, apart from their theological profundity, is how much human fun there is in the whole thing. And so Paul didn't found Christianity. Jesus Christ founded Christianity. Paul was not a god. He was a flesh and blood human being of immense, great talent. Jesus didn't always choose the best people to be his apostles. One of them betrayed him absolutely. Peter denied him 3 times. The disciples went to sleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the story of the gospel is that these very ordinary folk are transformed into great agents of history through the love and redemption of Jesus. They never lost faith in Jesus. More importantly, he never lost faith in them. But Paul, his writings are incredibly important. They're among the most important writings in all of human history. But I also just love the humanity of Paul. So I fell in love with the letter of Galatians. I know there's an argument you shouldn't privilege one bit of scripture over another, but as a journalist, I love the letter of Galatians. Right at the start of the letter, Paul's being very sweet, and then he goes up to Jerusalem and meets Peter, James, and John and submits himself a bit to church authority, asks for their approval. He's being a good boy. Then a minute later, he's having a furious argument with Peter, whom he calls Cephas, of course. He says, I told Cephas to his face he was wrong, and I told him this is rubbish. You've got to listen to me. I got the right answer here. Then he goes on a bit. He doesn't like the people who he sees are misleading the Galatians. So he says, I wish they would all go and castrate themselves, which you don't know if that's humorous 2,000 years ago, but it's pretty vigorous, And then, of course, there are these sublime and magnificent passages about Jesus pouring himself out for us and about neither Jew nor Greek and so on. But then, of course, he's also concerned with fundraising. The early Christians didn't live just by diaphanous vision. They had to, if you don't work, you don't eat, and we've got to get some money send back to the Jerusalem church and so forth. So this also, to me, attests to its authenticity, because if you were making these documents up later on, you wouldn't put all this stuff in. And a passage I referred to earlier where so Paul is the genius, but Peter is ultimately the boss. And Peter says to everybody, yeah, I know Paul can be a bit difficult, but he's my beloved brother, and what he writes is scripture, and you've got to put up with him, and you've got to learn from him. And I find Paul immensely attractive character. I love the fact that he, and then there are times where he's terribly discouraged, where he's almost disappointed to the point of death, and he's very open about it all. But finally, at the end of his life, he reflects, I've kept the faith, I've run the race, and here I am, and he's surrendering himself again to the Lord. The other final reflection on him, he always understands that he himself is prone to sinfulness, and he's quite explicit about this and very direct. And in all his complex, manifold qualities, he's very easy, I think, for a modern person to relate to.
Oh yeah, and you know, that I am the chief of sinners type thing. But also, I mean, you're right about the humor, because in that thing about castrating themselves, he's talking to people who are saying, look, to Gentiles, once they become Christians, they need to go and circumcise themselves. And Paul says, well, listen, you might as well just go and cut the whole lot off. It's just, I think it's hilarious. And I think it's deliberately hilarious. I mean, I think it's sarcastic and biting and ironic and so on. And that just makes me feel so good, because there are far too many Christians say, oh, don't be like that. Let's go on to this one. You read through the Gospels as a journalist on the starting basis they are true. How should a secular reader, assuming the Gospels aren't true, read them?
Well, I think, first of all, the great thing is to read them. Now, a lot of people have said to me, so I wanted to establish the proposition that the New Testament is not threatening or closed off to normal reading. There are parts of it that are hard to understand, parts of it that are, you know, excited theological study for 2,000 years, but 95% of it is open to just plain reading. Just read it for its sense. And of course, the writing is magnificent, even across 2,000 years and across all these translations. So, David, people say to me, where do I start? Christian friends of mine who just aren't in the practice of reading the Gospels, or some atheist friends. So we all have our different favourites and so on. But what I advise people who aren't used to it is to start with the Gospel of Luke. I find Luke a very warm gospel because it's got more women in it than the others. And also Luke, he's a journalist. You know, he's the Bob Woodward of the Jesus movement. He says, look, I've read this Bible reading we had at the beginning of our session here. He says, I've read all the accounts. I've spoken to all the people. Here is the scoop. And it's a very accessible, easy to read book. Then I would read the first letter of John, because the tone of voice of John is spectacular. John, his whole life, he just can't get over the wonder of the experience of Jesus that he's had, and the wonder of Christ and his Christology, as they say, is magnificent. That I myself love the letter to the Galatians, so I think that's a great fun letter to read. And then, of course, John's Gospel, because the identity of Jesus is so clear in John's Gospel. But I wouldn't advise an atheist to have, you know, to read it with an open mind or something. Just read it as a story to start with and see where it takes you. But I'd caution any atheist, it's quite dangerous. You know, you never know what's going to happen to you once you read it.
You're making me smile, because it's funny, I feel a very kindred spirit with you. In the book, you talk about various culture things. I'm going, I've seen all those films. I know all those books. I know, you know, I was just thinking, this is my soul brother, you know, if I believed in reincarnation. But the other aspect of that, I was saying, please say Luke. And I thought you might say Luke, because Luke, of course, not just a journalist, but historian, a doctor. I would say Luke is, the Gospel of Luke is Luke part 1. The book of Acts is Luke part 2. You know, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's fabulous stuff. Of course, we're here on City Legal, and you've been recommending Paul. Well, Paul was essentially a lawyer, you know, so you know, that's where he's got the precision of language. You know, I think that a lot of that comes from him having to deal with, you know, religious and civic law. And of course, he knew how to appeal to the law as well, you know, when he appeals to Caesar and so on. So all of that is fascinating. Our time is just about gone. So can you answer this question briefly, and then I'll explain to people how we may continue this discussion in another way. How did your own faith evolve by reading the New Testament in this thorough manner?
So, David, that's the kind of question I find very uncomfortable, because all of my life, I've been a believing Christian, you know.
Yeah.
But I've also had a lot of trouble living up to the most elementary norms of Christianity. And I mean, I've been a journalist for 40 years, you know, in a sense, no more need be said, you know, and I don't make any claims for myself, but it's very good to spend time in the New Testament. It certainly was good for me. And the compelling nature of Jesus' personality is there in the New Testament. And it's a wonderful thing to to experience. I don't have a sense really. A lot of people have a sense of their own journey. I don't really have that sense. I mean, because I was a cradle Christian, Christianity to me in a sense has been more of a circle than a straight line. And there have been times in my life when I've been more heroic and times in my life when I've been very, very derelict. And, you know, the great thing is Jesus doesn't abandon you, and you can always console yourself with that thought. He's not going to give up on you, whatever times you have. But let me just say, it was enormous fun to write this book, and you know, you wouldn't do anything else really. It was terrifically enjoyable to write the book.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I wish we could continue because I would want to unpack quite a lot of that, and we never even got round to Catholicism. You know, we never got round to journalists and purgatory. You know, we managed to avoid all these things. I think, you know, some of the questions. Let me just say that someone asked, "How do you reconcile the cruelty of the cross with the love of God?" And the answer to that is read the Gospels and you'll see. You know, because the cruelty of the cross expresses the love of God. Someone asked about the Benedictine option. That would be a great question as well. And someone asked about the proposed religious discrimination laws, but we're not going to be able to go into these. However, I do want to say this to those who are watching. Greg and I are going to be producing a podcast going through his book. And what I mean by that is we'll do a chapter at a time, because all of these subjects deserve a much deeper interrogation and thinking through. The book itself, which I would highly commend, I would urge you to get. It will stimulate you and make you think, and it will challenge you. I personally, and I don't often say this, but I absolutely love it. I've just engaged with it from the beginning. I stopped highlighting it because it was just turning into a rainbow book, you know. But so we will do that. If you've got any questions about what's been said today, please feel free to contact me or through City Legal. And, you know, that's fine. We'll continue that discussion. But right now, Greg, I want to thank you so much. You can either go back to your bed or for your breakfast. Thank you so much for being with us. I'll let you say something, and then John will say goodbye to everybody.
Well, thank you so much, David. And it's a real joy to talk about these things. And David, you coped with the Fidel Castro element of my personality very well. You know, I tend to talk continuously for hours once I start. So you reined that in. You managed it all very well. But I'm very grateful to everyone on the call today, and I'm just thrilled to be part of your fellowship for this morning. And thank you very much indeed. And, you know, if I was going to get up early, it would be only for something like this. And I just offer thanks to everyone involved. Thanks, guys. Right, John, it's all yours.
Well, David and Greg, thank you once again for a very thought-provoking interview. We all, I'm sure, are incredibly grateful for both of your time to share your thoughts. But as David said, no doubt there may be some other questions that might have arisen for you this morning, and we want to keep that conversation going. So if you want to ask those questions, let me encourage you to fill out our feedback form via the link in the chat function so you can get them answered. And that'd be a great way to get in contact with the City Legal team and pass them on to David, and I'm intrigued to see what answers you may have. Maybe you'd also like to talk to someone more about the Bible, or stay updated with further City Legal events. Maybe you'd like to join a hope group where people gather together to think about what they are thankful for and to read a small part of one of the 4 biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, of Jesus, and think about what hope there is in the world. Well, to do any of that, please head to our feedback form, leave some contact details, and a member of the City Legal team will be in contact with you shortly. Otherwise, we hope that you stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next City Legal event. Bye for now.